is Adam Sayner, and I've been growing mushrooms for around about 12 years now. In the first 5 years I grew them in the conventional way on sterilised substrate, but over the last 7 or 8 years really specialised on growing them in what we call the low-tech way of growing mushrooms. And that's really the focus of this presentation here today. Together with my colleague Eric, who's running a separate talk on this summit about different revenue streams for mushroom farms, so do check his talk out as well. Together we run GroCycle in the UK, and our specialisation really has been on these low-tech ways of growing mushrooms. For example, we grow on cold water pasteurised substrates, like we've got here some pasteurised straw, and so we're going to be getting into a bit of the detail on what exactly low-tech mushroom farming is, what differences there are to conventional growing, and why we think it's a really good method of growing, and also in what situations it doesn't work so well in as well. So I'm going to go and jump behind the computer now and we can dig into the detail.
So there's a number of things we want to cover in this presentation. I'm going to start off by just looking at what I think are the limitations in traditional mushroom cultivation techniques. And then I'm going to go on to talk about what low-tech mushroom farming is, how it's different to traditional mushroom cultivation, and we'll go into a bit of detail looking at some particular aspects that are different types of substrate, different varieties that you might be growing, and just the kind of different mindset that's approached from. Then I'm going to just show you some examples of some low-tech mushroom farms, just so you can understand what they look like in practice at different sizes and scales and budgets. And then I just want to talk also about the limitations of low-tech mushroom farming, because it's obviously, like anything, there's always upsides and downsides to it. And I just want to make sure you're aware of what the downsides are to low-tech mushroom farming, or what the limitations are. And then we'll finish up by just sort of talking about for which type of people and which situations low-tech mushroom farming works for or doesn't work for, so that you can go away from this thinking a little bit about whether it's the right way of growing mushrooms for you. All right, let's get started. So like I said right at the very beginning of this, I used to grow mushrooms in the conventional way, and I'll come on and define what that is in just a minute, but I grew like this for 2 or 3 years, and I grew a range of different varieties, medicinal varieties, gourmet varieties, and set up on a relatively small scale, making and growing around about 30 to 50 kilograms of mushrooms per week in a couple of shipping containers, and I was using a set of pressure cookers to sterilize all of this substrate before I then went ahead and introduced the spawn and grew them on all the way through the other stages of the growing process. And it was actually this experience of growing mushrooms in this way over the first few years that actually set me on a path to try and find simpler ways of growing, because I found there were a number of limitations to this way of growing. So you can see in this picture here, that's me in the lab that I built at the time in front of a couple of flow hoods, which have got HEPA filters and some big fans on the top, so they push air through the HEPA filters, and on the other side of that you're working in a very sterile environment. So the way that traditional mushroom cultivation takes place is that you sterilize the substrate at high heat, and that completely kills off any living organism that might be on the substrate, which would otherwise compete with your mushroom spawn. And then you open up the bags of substrate in front of a sterile airflow like this and introduce the spawn, seal the bags back up, and move on to the incubation phase. Now, of course, in order to do that, you need sterile equipment and a sterile environment. So you're going to need either an autoclave or a set of pressure cookers in order to sterilize the substrate or the grain if you're producing your own spawn. But you also then need sterile environments. So you need either a flow hood or some kind of clean air environment, some kind of lab-based setup, so that you can be sure you're not going to introduce any spores whatsoever into this completely sterile substrate. You see, the thing with growing with completely sterile substrate is it means it's a blank canvas for any other organism that can get in onto that substrate. It will start to grow in the complete absence of any competition, and that means it contaminates quite easily if you don't have a sterile environment. But of course, the equipment alone isn't enough. You also need to understand aseptic technique, by which I mean you just need to understand the process, how to work in a sterile way, so that you, as the main source of contaminants in a clean space, so that you don't introduce competing organisms, from your skin. The surface of our skin and our hair, our breath is full of bacteria that would love to grow on your substrate. So you need to understand the process, which is not extremely difficult to learn, but it does take time to really practice it and for it to become second nature to the point where you have consistent results. Because of the fact you need the sterile equipment and the growing space, it's actually a more expensive way to set up and start growing mushrooms. So when I first started growing mushrooms, I think I set up with a budget of around about £20,000, and that's around about $25,000 by the way. And that was what was really needed in order to just kit the whole place out, buy all these pressure cookers, which were quite expensive, create the lab environment. And I now know that that wasn't necessary. I could have definitely set up on a much lower budget in order to get going. So it is a more expensive way to get started, and it's also, I think, quite a time-intensive process. If you think about filling the bags full of the substrate, you then have to steam sterilize that substrate, and depending on what equipment you have, that can take anywhere from say 4 hours for that cycle to complete, or some autoclaves it's going to take more like 24 hours because you need quite a bit of time for the substrate to heat up and then also to cool back down again afterwards. So the whole process of getting to the point where you've got inoculated substrate ready to go to the incubation phase takes a lot longer. So these sorts of things led me down this path to try and work out, surely there's a simpler, easier, cheaper way to grow mushrooms, and it turns out that there is. So this is the technique that we call low-tech mushroom farming. It really encompasses a whole load of different aspects, so there's not really one particular thing that you can say low-tech mushroom farming is all about. There's a few different aspects to it, and of course it's not a black or white thing. There's sort of a scale, so there are some people that practice some elements of low-tech mushroom farming mixed with some elements of traditional cultivation techniques as well. So just to break it down then, you can really look at it in terms of there are two aspects of low-tech mushroom farming. The first one is the simpler growing method. So we implement a few different ways of growing than a traditional mushroom farm would. One of those is cold water pasteurization of the substrate. So whereas traditionally you'd be working with sawdust that's been supplemented with other nutrients, and because it's full of high nitrogen content, you have to fully sterilize that material to completely kill off any organisms that will already be on the wood chip, the sawdust, or whatever supplement you're using. You have to completely heat treat it. Whereas the methods that we use, we go for pasteurization instead. And the difference there is that at the end of the pasteurization process, you've killed off most of the competing organisms, but there are still some bacteria that survive the pasteurization process, and they actually, you can think of them almost as sort of friendly bacteria. They live on the substrate and they prevent it from being colonized by other organisms until your oyster mushroom mycelium grows across it quick enough so that it then sort of takes over from them. So it kind of holds the substrate ready for the mushroom mycelium to fully colonize it. And so this method of pasteurization instead of sterilization is not new to low-tech mushroom farming. That's the way that oyster mushrooms have traditionally been cultivated for quite a long period of time. But normally that pasteurization is done under heat. So it's usually done in either tunnels or containers of substrate where it gets layered up, filled full of straw, and then steam is pumped in to pasteurize, which happens at around about 65 degrees to 80 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, you're going to kill off most living organisms. But obviously, to do that, you need the means of which to create that heat temperature. So whether that's steam or on a more simple basis, you can also just use a hot water bath, which many small-scale mushroom growers will start out with, like an oil drum filled up with water, propane burner underneath that heats that water up to the desired temperature range, and then you can drop into that a basket of straw, and that hot water will pasteurize the substrate. We prefer a step simpler than that, which is cold water pasteurization, and we do that with basically a container that we fill with water. To that water we add some hydrated lime. Now hydrated lime has a very high pH level, and by adding that to the water you can raise the pH of the water to around about 11 or 12, which is a really high pH. Not many organisms can live in that kind of environment. And so when you soak the straw in it, it kills off the vast majority of living organisms that may have been on that straw, so that when you take it out from there and add your mushroom spawn to it, you've got a pretty clean substrate. So not only do we employ cold water pasteurization, but we also sometimes choose our substrate accordingly. So we do work a lot with chopped straw, but we also do work with pellets, so pelleted materials. So that might be sawdust pellets, it might be straw pellets, or it may be some other kind of supplement that we add in a pellet form as well. For example, soybean hull pellets, or sugar beet pellets is another popular one. But there are loads of different materials which have been pelletized, and it's that process of pelletization that enables you to grow really without sterilizing the substrate, because during the process of a material being turned into a pellet, it is done under quite high pressure and a lot of heat is generated. It basically kind of sterilizes that material in the process of becoming a pellet, so that all you need to do is add water to it, and as long as you use it straight away afterwards, you've got a relatively clean material. So this is, I guess, one of the fundamental differences between low-tech mushroom growing and conventional mushroom growing, which would normally imply sterilized substrate. We accept the premise that there is going to be competing organisms in our substrate. You know, we try to eliminate as many as we can, but we accept that there will be some there, and we try to tip the balance in favor of our mushroom mycelium, out competing them by providing the ideal growing conditions, you know, ideal substrate, good air exchange within the substrate, which is very important for low-tech mushroom growing, the right heating environment, the right substrate for the right species. All of that, if you get it right, you'll find a very high success rate growing mushrooms on a non-sterile substrate. So we like to choose the right substrate. We like to either cold water pasteurize it or use already clean substrate like pellet substrate. And we also like to select the right strains. So we work primarily with oyster mushrooms because they're a very aggressive and fast-growing mushroom. We've also grown shiitake mushrooms in a kind of low-tech pasteurized straw substrate, but they are a bit more tricky. We actually have, we run a course, and we have a course community of people from all over the world that grow mushrooms in this low-tech way. And increasingly there are people in that community that are expanding into new varieties grown in this way, using hardwood sawdust pellets. So the range of species that we're able to grow in this way is expanding as people experiment with different types of substrate, different strains in their own environment. So at the moment we mainly grow oyster mushrooms, but in the next year or so ahead, we're really going to spend a lot of time experimenting to widen that range into other gourmet mushroom varieties. Now, we don't just select the strains in terms of it's an oyster mushroom, but we also look to select based on the temperature range that oyster mushroom likes to grow in. So the picture here that you can see, there's a number of different oyster mushroom species there, and they all like to grow in slightly different environments. So broadly speaking, you have cold weather oyster strains and you have warm weather oyster strains. And what we do is we just select the variety based on the season that we're growing in. So because of that, it means you can grow mushrooms in a seasonal way. It really depends on where you are in the world and what kind of temperature swings you get with your seasons. But it is possible to grow year-round in the temperate climate without heating and cooling of the growing of the fruiting room, just by selecting cold weather strains in the winter and warm weather strains in the summer. And we've grown like this all year round in the UK. We have a pretty favourable temperature range both in winter and summer that it's possible to grow like this. Obviously, if you're in a different part of the world where you get much, much hotter summers, then it becomes more challenging. At that point, you have an option. You can either just select to grow seasonally when the ambient environment is more favourable. So that might be maybe in the winter, the spring and autumn, and maybe you stop production for the summer if it gets too hot. Or it may be that you decide to go down the route of managing the temperature in your fruiting environment, and that usually involves some air conditioning. One note of caution with that, if you're thinking along that line, is that you have a lot of air exchange inside the fruiting room with mushrooms, and so because of that, the demand of energy to treat the air in the fruiting room is quite high. It's quite an energy intensive thing to do to heat or cool a fruiting room, which is why if you're really talking about the lowest tech way of growing, you would look for seasonal production and not heating or cooling the grow rooms. However, obviously lots of people, like I said, they like to mix different processes. So we have many people on the course in Australia where they face really high temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius or above, who have chosen to employ temperature control in their fruiting rooms in order that they can grow all through the year. So that is a possibility as well. The ideal range for growing mushrooms in is between 5 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius. So in Fahrenheit, that's 41 to 86 Fahrenheit. Within that range, you can grow mushrooms all year round. When you get hotter than that, it can be problematic to find varieties that grow in that kind of heat. And lower than that, you find they just slow right the way down, and obviously below freezing, they just can't grow at all. So that's really the kind of parameters that you're looking to grow in. So those are some of the main growing methods which we employ in low-tech mushroom farming. But there's second point really is that it's a much cheaper and simpler farm setup, and by that I mean the equipment that you need and the cost of the growing setup. So this is really down to the fact that you don't need sterile environment, you don't need a clean room to grow in, you don't need autoclaves or pressure cookers, and also you can work with fewer bags. So what I mean by that is that when you're working with sterilized substrate, you tend to do it in smaller bags that you can load into an autoclave or a pressure cooker that won't take too long to heat up to the sterilization temperature. When you work with larger masses of substrate, it takes a really, really long time to heat up right in the very center of the substrate. Quantities of any more than about 5 kilograms or 10 pounds of substrate. And that obviously means you have to handle a lot of bags if you're doing this at any kind of scale. And you'll often see farms that have got thousands of bags in production at any one point in time. Each one of those bags needs to be moved around a number of times throughout the growing process. So it's quite a labor-intensive process. When you're working with pasteurized substrate instead, you can create much larger masses of substrate. So the picture that you see here is a 6-foot column of straw with the winter oyster mushroom growing on it, and it's around about 18 kilograms in weight, which is about 40 pounds in weight. And we have seen a number of farms that grow in larger quantities than this. Some farms will grow with columns that weigh up to 100 pounds of substrate. So ultimately, you can get up to 10 times less bags needed in your production for the same quantity of substrate just by working with larger columns of substrate rather than thousands of smaller 10-pound bags. So there's a big advantage there, I think, in terms of it just being a simpler farm setup that you can employ. You can actually hang the bags directly off the ceiling rather than needing lots of shelving and racking. So again, it's a cheaper and simpler farm setup. And as we'll see in a minute, it's not limited to just growing in bags like this. You can also grow in buckets, which is something we've been playing around with a lot this year in a bid to try and reduce the amount of single-use plastic in our production. And growing in buckets works really, really well if you use the right type of substrate. So this is something which I think you can scale that up on quite a big basis, a deep way of growing without the need for lots of infrastructure. So because of that, it's much easier to get started with a growing setup, and we'll come and have a look at some of these examples in just a minute. Now, before we move on and look at those, I do just want to mention one thing for all those people that may be watching this and thinking, well, I don't really want to run a mushroom farm, I just want to grow a few mushrooms for personal use. Really, the super low-tech way of doing this is outdoor mushroom production. So you can see in the pictures we have here, a couple of examples in the middle here of an outdoor mushroom fruiting chamber that we created, whereby we created kind of like a mini polytunnel or hoop house setup, which we have insect netting over the top of and shade cloth, and this enables us to fruit mushrooms outside seasonally when the ambient conditions are ideal. we also have a sprinkler system in there as well to create the humidity. So this kind of low-tech, simplified way of growing mushrooms is absolutely possible. Likewise to grow mushrooms on logs and also in wood chip beds. Now there are some downsides to grow mushrooms like this, particularly if you want to do it on an ongoing production. You tend to find in particular that pests become a problem. It's much more difficult to keep out pests from an outdoor growing setup, no matter how well you try to seal it, and the use of insect netting. They always find their way in through gaps around the edges, or every time that you open it up, they enter again. So this is one of the big downsides to growing like this outside, and that's why you won't see many people growing like this on an ongoing basis or as a commercial mushroom farm. But it is something that's absolutely doable, really, really simple to do if you just want to grow on a smaller scale at home, in your garden or on a homestead or a small permaculture farm. Definitely something to look into. All right, so let's look at some examples of low-tech mushroom farms so you can just kind of picture what this looks like. First one I want to show you is a hydroponics tent. A number of people in our course have built their fruiting rooms in a hydroponics tent. Really the benefit of them is that they're really cheap and easy to get. They're easy to set up. You can set them up in a couple of hours, and they come with all these little ports in the wall already there, and these are really useful for connecting up your ducting for ventilation, for running electrics in and out, for installing your lighting, all that kind of stuff. They're not the most well insulated tents, so they don't tend to hold the temperature very well in there. But again, if you're growing seasonally, that doesn't really matter. The great benefit really is that they're cheap and simple to set up, and they work really, really well. So this works well, of course, if you've got an existing space that you can just pop a tent up in. But what about if you've got, for example, something like a basement? Well, this is a really nice example from a guy called Martins in Latvia. He had a basement space which was empty, nothing really much happening in it, and he's converted that for mushroom production. One of the great things about basements is that because they're below ground, they tend to hold the temperature a little bit more stable than above ground. So you tend to find growing down there, you have less fluctuation with the extremities in summer and winter, which makes them potentially a really good place for growing mushrooms in. They also often are quite naturally damp. The main thing you have to bear in mind when growing in a basement is that you need quite a lot of fresh air exchange, especially in the fruiting stage of mushrooms. And so you need to make sure you've got a system for ducting fresh air in and exporting the old CO2-rich air back out of the room again. Because many of you who have grown oyster mushrooms before will know they don't like growing in a high CO2 environment. You have to be sucking that air back out and replacing it with fresh air. Here's another example then of a low-tech mushroom farm built inside of a building. So the top photo you can see there is the room as we moved into it. This is a farm that we built a few years ago in the city centre, and we were given an office block that was out of use, and we basically ripped out all the carpet, took everything out and installed inside of there some fridge panels, like a walk-in fridge unit, in which we built our mushroom growing room. So the picture you can see underneath that is the same room around about a month later, once everything had been installed and set up, and we put the first bags in ready to fruit. So this is again another really good example of how you can take an existing space and add a grow room inside of it to create your growing space. Likewise, another nice example is growing mushrooms in shipping containers. So this is our most recent mushroom farm that we converted these containers earlier on this year. You can see the green containers on the right there, which are the growing rooms. We have one for incubation and one for fruiting. And then you have to the side of that this lean-to area, which we use for storage of materials and working inside of if it's wet outside, for example, that kind of thing. This is a great way, again, of just getting something off the shelf. There are lots of shipping containers out there. They're fairly low cost to buy second-hand, and like most spaces, you can retrofit them for growing mushrooms in by adding in electric supply, humidification, ventilation for the air exchange, lighting, that kind of thing to create the ideal environment inside of the container. So what about if you want to grow on a commercial scale? Is that something that's possible with this low-tech approach to growing mushrooms? Well, yes, it is. So far I've shown you a few examples of kind of small to medium scale low-tech mushroom farms. But this is an example of a farm in the US. It's a connection that we have with a mushroom consultant who set up a number of these farms. And they're basically a commercial scale of what of what we do basically. It's a much larger farm. The output is around about £3,000 of mushrooms per week, and the setup cost is around about $100,000 to set it up. It takes around about 4 or 5 people full-time working on the farm to do the production, and there's usually 6 grow rooms. The picture we've got here is one of those grow rooms, and you would have 6 of those set up, and you cycle different batches through the rooms. Now with this setup you can generate up to $100,000 of mushrooms per month output. So that's the value of the mushrooms in output from a small farm like this. It's only on a footprint of around about 5,000 square feet. So it's a small space. There's an initial setup cost, and then with just 4 to 5 people you can run an ongoing production that produces $100,000 worth of fresh oyster mushrooms per month. So the focus of this farm really has been just how to grow mushrooms in the most profitable way, is to focus on oyster mushrooms because the production cost is much lower, and to grow them on a scale that's big enough that you can generate a substantial revenue from it. So I really like this way of applying basically the same techniques to a commercial basis and just scaling everything up a little bit. I think it's a really nice example of where you can go with it. So we talked a lot about all the benefits of low-tech mushroom farming, but of course there's got to be some limitations as well, and there definitely is, so I just want to make sure that you're aware of those. First up then really is that it tends to be a more limited range of species. So we focus a lot on growing oyster mushrooms, and there are a number of different oyster varieties. As you can see in this picture here, these are all different types of oyster mushrooms. You've got summer oyster mushrooms, you've got winter oysters, yellow oysters, pink oysters, you've got brown oysters, blue oysters, elm oysters, a whole range. So if you choose the different varieties, you can actually get a nice selection of oysters growing in this low-tech way. But they're oyster mushrooms. You're not looking at growing a wide range of gourmet and medicinal mushrooms in the same way that you would if you're growing on supplemented sawdust. As I mentioned earlier, we're finding new ways to grow these other species by experimenting a little bit with it, but as it stands, really the guaranteed way of growing in the low-tech way involves the aggressive growth of oyster mushrooms, which are also just really, really good at growing on a wide range of different substrates. So some people also can experience lower yields growing mushrooms in the low-tech way. The main reason for that is that when you grow with supplemented sawdust, you can add a lot of supplementation, a lot of additional nutrient to the mix. In particular, nitrogen is an important factor there. It's very easy to add a lot of supplement to the mix if you're then going to sterilize it, and then that enables you to get good yields. Now, it's not the case that you always get lower yields when growing mushrooms the low-tech way. As I mentioned, that farmer I just showed you a second ago, they have extremely high productivity, biological efficiency in their production of around about 175%. So it's totally possible to grow oyster mushrooms on chopped straw and get very high yields. We consistently get a yield of around about 25% of our substrate weight in fresh mushrooms. So, if we have 10 kilos of substrate, we'll yield 2.5 kilos of fresh mushrooms from it, which is a good yield. However, if you're growing on something like the Masters mix, which is 50% soy hull pellets mixed with 50% sawdust pellets, people have been able to get higher yields there of around about 30 to 35%. So obviously higher yields are possible if you grow on sterilized substrate, but you can still get pretty good yields growing in a low-tech way as well. Now, low-tech mushroom growing, you're probably going to be using a spawn rate of between 5 and 10%. And if you're just starting out, you might want to start more at the higher end of around about 10%. And as you get more and more experienced and you get everything dialed in, you can reduce that to 5% or potentially lower if you have good consistent production and everything else is clean in your operation. But compare that to working with sterilized substrate where you can get away with lower spawn rates of say 2%. You have got a higher spawn rate in low-tech mushroom growing and higher spawn cost. Added to that is the fact that in some areas around the world, cooling and heating is required in order to grow year-round. So for many people, they want to be in production every single week of the year. And if you're in a really hot or really cold place and at certain times of the year, you're going to need to consider installing heating and cooling equipment in order to moderate that like I said, this is one of the aspects that some people do implement alongside the low-tech mushroom growing methods. They might implement some non-low-tech farm setup aspects as well. All right, so with all of this considered, who does low-tech mushroom farming work well for, and in what situations does it not work well? So I think it works really well if you're on a low budget, if you're a beginner, if you want to just minimize the labor input, and if you're happy to focus on oyster mushrooms. In all of these situations, low-tech mushroom farming is going to work really well for you. I think the biggest decider for a lot of people is the budget that they have available. A lot of people don't have, $20,000, $50,000 in order to get started. And so for many people, they're going to want to get started on the lowest possible budget that they can, especially if you're just getting started and you want to just explore the possibility of, is this something I enjoy doing? Is this something that's possible for me? Low-tech mushroom growing can be a good way to begin, and you can always decide to add in layers of other growing methods further on down the line if you want to branch out into growing other varieties, for example. Who doesn't it work well for? So it's not really the right way to grow mushrooms if you're absolutely set on wanting to grow multiple varieties of gourmet and medicinal mushrooms. So for example, if you want to offer, say, 10 different varieties of mushrooms, it's not going to be the best way to go. If you want to grow lots of medicinal varieties, you're better off growing on sterilized, supplemented sawdust instead. And in general, if you've decided that's the method that you want to grow with, if you want to grow with supplemented sawdust, you're going to be better off sterilizing that substrate instead of pasteurizing it, as we tend to do in the low-tech way. Okay, so that's it for this presentation. We've taken a look at some of the challenges of traditional mushroom cultivation and explained why we choose to grow mushrooms in the low-tech way instead. We've seen some of the major benefits, like the easier growing methods and the cheaper setup, as well as some of the limitations, like the higher rate of spawn use, the reduced range of species that you can grow with, and the need for heating and cooling your fruiting room in different parts of the world at different times of the year. I hope that you found this presentation interesting and insightful, and I hope that it's useful in your own journey with mushroom cultivation. If you want to learn any more about low-tech mushroom farming, then do check out our YouTube channel. We have a load of useful videos there. And we also have a free ebook if you want to download that. Just go to GroCycle.com/ebook, and you can get an ebook there on how to set up a low-tech mushroom farm. All right, that's it for now. I really hope that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you soon.